Cheers.
Cheers!
What are we drinking today?
Mineola Sweet.
Mineola Sweet.
Isn't that what we're calling this?
I'm not sure if we're going to say sweet.
Okay.
Just because of the tartness of the Mineolas.
Mm-hmm. Mineola Sunshine Rain. Maybe.
I like that, especially since we have a leak in our roof.
You want to talk us through how you did it?
Yeah, sure. So at first I was just peeling Mineolas and juicing them by hand.
Okay.
And then we were like, well, it's taking a long time. So we broke out a bladder press, which we have, but Andrew and I had never used it before. So we looked up videos online how to use it. It's very easy. And basically we just threw them in the bladder press and then added water to the bladder. The bladder expands, pushes outward, and juices the Mineolas in like 30 seconds. and then the cleanup took like an hour. Yeah. And then, we just collected that juice, and this is like, maybe 10% Mineola juice, 90% mead.
Nice. Yeah, it's just a little bit, but it gives it a great like citrus, tangerine, lemon character in the foretaste particularly. Like there's this great lemon tangerine quality, and then the sweetness really comes through, and then the finish is almost like a bite of a Mineola tangerine. It's cool.
Yeah, it's very smooth for like how citrusy it is.
Yeah. Because the Mineolas, like if you bite into one, it's almost like that lemon, like the citric acid kick of a lemon. Mm-hmm. They almost have that, but then they have that like, they're orange, and when you the juice has got that like orange
bite to
yeah,
it.
Yeah.
And I think it's made to be drank fresh, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully we'll have it at the farmers markets here soon, and local folks can come and try it out and pick it up. And the fruit's local, the honey's the organic wildflower from Brazil, and then the fermentation's here in Oceanside. So
yeah. All right, so today we're gonna do a deep dive into
yeast,
not
and
literally.
not literally, sure, not literally, but we're gonna go into like how our experience has informed our decisions with the yeast we use with mead and even beer, and how we come to our conclusions. And hopefully it is helpful for you listeners if you're just starting out or if you're more advanced. Our perspective on yeast and how it interacts with honey and beer.
I think we're going to take it from Brandon's perspective. Brandon Wool has a lot of background in brewing, so brewers think about yeast in a different way than mead makers do. And so one of the things that we get to do here on the podcast is talk about mead making thinking. And so for Brandon to lay out how beer brewers think about yeast as kind of a starting point, and then to talk about yeast from a mead maker's perspective will hopefully help you, the listener, evolve your thinking, maybe from a beer brewing background or that familiarity that exists pretty widely to a more mead focused way of thinking about yeast. And to be honest, like yeast is incredible and super complicated. So diving into the world of yeast could be a lifelong pursuit. I was thinking about like, what if I got a PhD in yeast? It's like, I'd know a lot about a very little thing.
That's literal.
But it could take a whole lifetime to master yeast, and I think that's part of the craft of mead making is understanding that we can spend our whole lives doing this thing, and there's still going to be more to learn and more to experiment with and more to have fun creating. So I'm going to let Brandon jump into how he thinks about yeast with his brewing background, and then what questions or what observations he's seeing as he evolves into more of a mead-focused fermenter.
So let's start with where did you start with yeast and beer?
Well, because I didn't start with beer with brewing.
Okay.
Well, I guess I did with home brewing a little bit, but with with beer, there's like broadly speaking, there's lager and there's ale,
Okay.
and the difference is the yeast. So those like broad categories that include like hundreds of styles within them are all a difference of yeast. And ale came first. The ale yeast ferments at a warmer temperature, and so that's what most beer has been throughout the history of beer. But then I forget around what year, but I think it was I could be wrong on this, but I think it was the Carlsberg brewery was the first to isolate and use lager yeast, which ferments at a colder temperature. And because it ferments colder, it produces like fewer esters, so it's like a cleaner like flavor profile.
Okay.
So the first question is, if like, well, we want to make a beer, what kind of beer should it be? There's hundreds of styles of beer. If you're thinking yeast selection, the first question is, are we making an ale or a lager? And then you break it down from there.
Gotcha.
Also with beer, there's wild yeasts like Brettanomyces, and those I'm pretty sure are considered ale yeasts, but they're their own separate category, and they look different under a microscope. So they're like they're evolved very differently from standard ale yeasts, but they do ferment at ale temperatures, and those produce like all kinds of like weird flavors and funkiness. So if let's say you're home brewing and you're like, well, what kind of beer do I want to make? You think, well, what kind of yeast do I want to use? And those are your three broad categories: ale, lager, wild yeast.
Okay. And so, do you think technology played a role in us being able to ferment colder, essentially?
Oh, yeah.
Which opened that up, essentially,
Yeah.
to brewers?
That's a good question. Yeah, so for most of brewing history, humans didn't know yeast existed.
Mhm.
So it was just like, we have this magic stick, and we stir with the stick, and then it tastes good. If you don't use the stick, it tastes different.
Or you dump the leavings from the last batch, like the barm, which was like the dust at the bottom of the barrel, into the next batch, and like that was God is good, right? In German, like the word for yeast is God is good, and like it was kind of like, hopefully it works, and we get blessed with alcohol to make our celebrations fun.
Yeah, and back then it certainly took a lot longer to ferment because they were starting with a lot fewer cells. But then I think it was Louis Pasteur who realized, like, hey, there's like little things too, and they're on everything.
Like one of the founders of germ theory.
Yeah.
Right? And like pasteurization. Like this dude discovered that magical substance that was critical to making alcohol, which was critical to making civilization, was kind of like not just a divine intervention. It was this microorganism that they could see under a microscope, and if he isolated, didn't he go to the brewery and like hide the culture in his hat or something?
Oh, I don't know that story.
I've heard a story about
that. It sounds like him. That's a Louis Pasteur thing for sure.
Okay, so I mean, we got lager is the newer, improved, where you can do it brews at colder temps essentially, and so
with technology, refrigeration wasn't always a thing.
So if you're brewing with lager, you probably want to do a refrigeration brewing type, or does it depend on the lager?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the lager and where you are. So like historically, and again, I didn't like do research before this podcast, so if you're listening, take it with a grain of salt, do your own research. But I believe that the reason lager yeast evolved is because it was people brewing in colder temperatures during the colder months. That yeast was sort of like selected, evolutionarily, because they were just brewing at it, colder temperatures. So Germany, for example, it's cold there.
Boston lager, that's another one. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it. Well, I guess Boston is cold
in the winter. Yeah.
So it's So if you're not selecting your yeast and inoculating your beer with your chosen yeast, you're using what's available.
Around you
in the air. And so if you're brewing during colder months, you're making lager, automatically. And so, but nowadays, if you're choosing what yeast you want to use and you're inoculating your beer or your wort with that yeast, if you want your lager yeast to do its job well, yeah, you want to ferment at a colder temperature, 49 to 58,
Gotcha.
broadly speaking. Yeah.
And then ale yeast is mainly above that.
Yeah, like 65 at the lowest to like 75-ish. There's some that go higher.
And then when it comes to beer and like diving into different ale and lager yeast, how do you dive into the different types of yeast if you're brewing and like come to conclusions of like this one's better for floral notes or this one's better for caramel notes? Is it all on the packaging or?
A lot of it is, yeah. You know, if you're on their website and reading about different producers' yeasts, they'll give you a broad like explanation of what it'll produce. There's all kinds of esters and phenols that yeasts make, and some of them make very little and they're very clean, and some produce a lot. So as a brewer, like if you are making a Belgian ale, one of the esters that's very common is isoamyl acetate, which is the like banana flavor, sometimes bubblegummy. And
Like
so
banana Laffy Taffy.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
So if you're like, well, I want to make a Belgian triple, and you drink a Belgian triple, and you're like, I want it to taste like this, and you go, well, what is this flavor? It's like, well, it's got this banana thing going on, and you look up, okay, what is that? It's isoamyl acetate. You can select a yeast that produces a lot of isoamyl acetate, and there's a whole range of different esters and phenols that are desirable in certain circumstances at certain levels, and some are undesirable but are still produced, and you just kind of go from there.
So it's about finding yeast that produce the right esters and phenols to create the flavor you want.
Yeah.
Okay.
In a lot of cases, it's the lack of those. So, like for example, lager yeast wouldn't produce a lot of esters, but if you're making a British, ESB, you want some fruity esters there.
Okay, so let's talk about esters and phenols then. So
Mhm.
what, in general, what are some flavor notes that esters produce or not produce that are desirable or not desirable?
Yeah, esters pretty much are fruity qualities.
Okay.
So again, I didn't do research before this podcast, but I believe an ester is a organic acid and an alcohol compound that combine during fermentation. And so esters can be produced in all kinds of foods. Like a lot of what we eat has esters in it, and that's why a lot of times you might taste a fermented drink and it reminds you of something else. It could literally be the same ester that is in this other food that you eat. And so just again, there's probably counterexamples, but generally speaking, esters are fruity flavored. And then phenols tend to be more chemical-y tasting. No, it's not like the right word for it. But like there's
Tannins are considered phenols, right?
Yeah,
Like wood
yeah.
smoke and
Yeah.
tobacco and leather.
Yeah, so one of the common esters in brewing is 4-vinyl glycol, which is like the clovey, like kind of thing. So, and that's in like Hefeweizens sometimes. So certain yeasts will make 4-vinyl glycol, and it's like, well, if you want that clovey, spicy note, then that's a phenol that you want to choose a yeast that produces that.
Gotcha. So there are some desirable phenols that people look for.
Yeah, less so. Not always, but phenols tend to be undesirable, but in some cases they are desirable for certain styles.
Gotcha. And depending on what yeast you produce, it'll tell you like what phenols it will produce. Essentially.
Yes, but then also the control you have is you can take a yeast where the producer says like low to no phenolic character or esters, but then if you ferment it way warmer than its spec is, it might make a lot of phenols. I'd say again, there's probably some guy who's like super smart about yeast who's like, no, that's not correct. But I would venture to say that every yeast is going to produce esters and phenols if you're fermenting it at a high temperature.
Well, Brandon, how many years of professional brewing experience do you have now?
13.
Yeah. So even though you're not like a PhD or a master's, like
Yeah.
you have a lot of experience. How many batches have you brewed professionally?
Like one or two. Yeah, not a lot. Yeah, I have a lot of on-the-job making beer experience, but not a formal education.
So I think you should give yourself credit for that. And like, yeah, there are people who have it piled higher and deeper, but like your experience speaks volumes to practical ways of thinking about this. So I think you should give yourself credit for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I also am interested to know what you think about attenuation and flocculation. Yeah, what do you think about those terms? What are those terms, if you don't mind defining them?
Attenuation is essentially like completing fermentation, or like the yeast's ability to ferment all of what's available, if that makes sense. And flocculation is when yeast kind of gets tired, essentially, and clumps together. And then because yeast is so small, normally it doesn't drop out of solution easily, but when it flocculates together, it forms bigger clumps, and that allows it to transit downward, eventually making, you know, like a slurry or paste at the bottom of the tank. And that's a really interesting question. I'm not going to answer it directly, but one thing that I personally think about when harvesting yeast, and I don't know, again, I don't know if this is true, but it's something that I've talked about with other brewers, and it's like a kind of like working experiment. Yeah. That in a given batch, there's going to be some genetic variation as the yeast is reproducing and budding, basically. And so not every copy is going to be perfect, hypothetically. And so you might have yeast that start flocculating earlier and yeast that flocculate later. So when you choose a yeast, that's another aspect you look for, is the attenuation and the flocculation. So some yeast, you might want a yeast that doesn't flocculate very well, I guess you'd say. And so if you're producing a beer that's very high ABV, you don't necessarily want a high flocculating yeast, because it might start flocculating before the job is done. Even if it has the ability to attenuate further, it might not do that just because it's so prone to flocculate and start dropping out. And then likewise, if you're making a hazy style, and not just hazy IPAs, but a Hefeweizen, a wit beer, you know, there's traditional styles that you want to be hazy. You want to choose a low flocculating yeast. And so what I'm getting to is, when you're harvesting from a tank, you may not want to harvest what's at the very bottom, nor maybe you don't want to harvest from like the beer that's still cloudy but is basically liquid. You might want to harvest like the top of the yeast pile, so you're not getting the stuff that flocculated earliest, and you're not getting the stuff that's still like not flocculating yet. You might want to get the stuff that flocculated towards the end of the fermentation being done, if that kind of makes sense. Because that's the stuff that, if you're going to repitch that, you're sort of choosing the yeast that is predisposed to flocculate only after the job is done, if that kind of makes sense.
You know, in mead making, we don't really harvest second generations and grow our own, and that's like a conventional wisdom thing, which I wonder if it still holds up, because I think that conventional wisdom is around from before nutrient additions and aeration were a common practice in mead making. So I'm wondering, you know, the theory was the yeast had gotten beaten up. Like, I heard an old Scott Labs yeast wizard talk about this like 14 years ago now. Was that a long ago? 12. I don't know, it was a long time ago. And he was like, oh, by the end of a mead fermentation, your yeast is so beat up, trying to harvest it for a secondary use, that's just shooting yourself in the foot. Don't do it. Use fresh yeast every time. But that was before nutrient addition and aeration were as widely practiced and understood in mead making. So I'm wondering if there's an update to that, like if it's possible to start practicing yeast harvest and repitch. But that would, my question to the listeners out there is, does anyone practice yeast harvesting and mead making? If so, what are you looking for to make sure that your yeast is going to be viable? Because that's a big characteristic to pay attention to, is viability of your yeast. And then, like, Brandon, I don't know if you think about alcohol tolerance and viability and cell counts at all, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are if you do.
That's an interesting question because even with beer styles, if you're making a 12% Russian stout, that's not the optimal batch to harvest from, but sometimes you might have to, and it you know, it is done. So that excuse me, that is something that we think about is like, is this like if we have 5 batches that are all finishing fermentation, we need to harvest yeast from 1 or 2 of them. Maybe they all have the same yeast if it's like the house yeast, so to speak. You would not want to harvest from a 12% beer, ideally. So regarding mead, yeah, that is more of a challenge, just because the ABV is so high. But if I would say if you look at it under a microscope and you do a viability test and it's healthy yeast, that you know, if you can confirm, yeah, this, you know, the viability is 98%, that it should be safe to. Yeah.
Cool.
So one big difference I'm getting from beer and mead is in beer it's super common to harvest, which is essentially taking yeast in a brew and taking it out essentially and then being able to reuse it
Yeah.
in a new brew.
Yeah.
Instead of having to use completely new yeast
Right.
in a new brew.
Yeah.
And so what you're saying is alcohol ABV is a big consideration because yeast at higher ABVs is more beat up, as Frank put it.
Yeah.
And most meads are much above 10%, and
Yeah.
usually 12 to 18 essentially. When beer, it's more common to have like 5 to 10%,
Yeah.
and the yeast is more harvestable
Yeah.
and reusable at that stage essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the way I think of it, and again, maybe this isn't like scientific, but it's, you think of like how much work that yeast has had to do, and during that work, there's going to be yeast that is dying off too. So it's not that like a higher ABV just means, well, that yeast like already worked so hard, so it's spent, because if you harvest it, it's going to make new cells anyway. So you're going to get like a new team coming in. You know, you're taking like a fraction of what you need, and because of aeration, it's going to multiply in its aerobic phase. And so it's not really just thinking like, well, that yeast already did so much work, so it can't do more because it's going to reproduce anyways, ideally. It's the way I think of it is that if you're taking from that tank, what percentage of that yeast is really like ready to keep going, and what percentage is like
Done.
dead. Yeah. So that's where, if the viability is good, I think you should be good to repitch. But if you're taking yeast from a 12% beer, I would just imagine the viability is going to be lower.
Do you have internal thresholds on viability numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I get, you know, it depends on the brewery, but I mean, anything below 90% you don't want to use, and ideally you want it to be above 95.
Cool. And you're doing that with a cell count and methylene blue, and you're measuring how many of the cells die blue
Yeah.
to indicate that they're dead,
Yeah.
versus the total number of cells.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So for the listeners or the watchers, if you use a stain, methylene blue or methylene violet, and there's probably other ones, but if the cell wall of the yeast is compromised, the stain will go into the cell. And so when you look at it under the microscope, you can see that one's blue, that one's not, that one's not, that one's not, that one's blue. And you do the math of what percentage have taken up the stain, and those are, you know, dead cells. So it's really easy to do if you have a microscope.
And a cytometer, which is a little cell plate. Like, the two biggest tools, I think, for understanding yeast and how they work in your meadery are a microscope and a hemocytometer. Like, if you can use those tools, you can get so much data so much faster than if you're just making batches and tasting them at the end of your fermentation. And then you start to see the correlations between a healthy yeast and a healthy mead and the outcomes and the flavor profile. So that's a question for me as a mead maker talking to a brewer, though you're more and more a mead maker every day, man. It's old Brandon. When you think about flavor profile in a beer, where does yeast stack up compared to the
Mhm.
other ingredients in terms of priority and influence on the final
Yeah,
beer?
well, that's a really good question. It depends on the style. So some styles yeast is like everything, and some styles you
For
want yeast.
instance,
A lot of Belgian styles, so the aforementioned Belgian triple, things like a Hefeweizen, the yeast is a huge part of the character. So
saisons and
yeah,
yeah.
Broadly speaking, old world beer, yeast is a bigger part of it, and then like American beer, yeast is generally less a part of it. Again,
Because the hops and the grain bill is higher.
It's especially with craft beer, like a West Coast IPA, we generally use a yeast that has little to no impact, and it's just there to ferment, and then all the flavor comes from mainly the hops, and to a lesser degree the malt. But if you're, for a lot of Belgian styles, yeast selection is kind of everything, and then you're using like a very light touch with everything else. And then, obviously grain always is a huge role because that's your fermentable sugar. But the interplay is the yeast and the grain, and then like hops are kind of like this addition that's outside of that.
But because of West Coast craft beer, like hops have become a primary thing within that category.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so I think that's a really important piece. And we've touched on a lot, right? We've touched on these major characteristics of yeast. We touched on phenolic and ester production. We touched on flocculation, attenuation, viability, alcohol tolerance, right? These are all key characteristics, and mead makers think about them too. But there's this key factor that I think Brandon's just touching on, which is the flavor contribution and the overall balance and style that yeast plays in a mead versus a beer. I think in a beer, for the most part, unless you're talking about old world Belgian styles, to a lesser extent German styles, right? Because like they're much more straight down the middle and clean fermentation profiles.
And in British ales too, like the yeast
is
tends
a
to
big
be
part. Yeah, like you can't make a Nottingham ale without Nottingham ale yeast, right? Yeah, it's really interesting, right? So in mead making, you take one must, split it into two batches. You mix your honey and water, you take that volume and you split it into two smaller volumes, and you add two different yeasts, and you're gonna get two totally different meads because the flavor profile and the attenuation contributed by the yeast is gonna totally change our mead stool, right? We've talked about in other advanced mead making theory courses, podcasts, about the legs of the mead stool, right? Alcohol, honey / sweetness, and then acid or other characteristic, right? And those three things need to kind of be in balance for the mead to stand up. And if one of the legs is too long, then the stool falls over. If one of the legs is too short, then the stool falls over. So you say, take that must and you split it into an ale yeast batch on one side and a champagne yeast batch on the other side, and do the same nutrient addition, though even that is now like in question. There's been some folks who are practicing like as needed nutrient addition, which is pretty cool. I'd love to learn more about that. Billy at Last Cause being one of them. He's using a yan meter during fermentation, and then he's dosing yan accordingly. And apparently Pete Bocklage has talked about this too. It's like state-of-the-art yeast management. So I'd love to get into that. But take your two batches, do an ale yeast on one side, a champagne yeast on the other side, and let's ideal condition this and say that they both turn out great. The ale yeast is going to have minimal fermentation characteristics, right? And the honey is going to be a lot more forward, and there'll be some esters and some phenolics, but it'll be like mostly a honey brew. And the champagne yeast, on the other hand, is going to be this dry, floral, much thinner bodied, for lack of a better word, floral champagne. So those two yeast selections are going to totally change the character of the underlying mead, and I think that really illustrates the point that in mead making, yeast selection is a key consideration, whereas in beer making, it's a important thing to consider, but not as critical as it is in mead making.
And I think my question to that goes back to Brandon was talking about how like hops are a big part of flavor addition right now instead of yeast. And a lot of people with mead add fruits. Do you think fruits is a comparable thing when it comes to like if you're adding fruits, you don't necessarily need to consider your yeast as much, just like in beer, where if you're adding hops, it's just like a ABV thing that you're using it for?
So it really depends. It's yeast selection and fruit addition are deeply interconnected, and depending on when you add the fruits, the yeast is going to influence the fruit expression hugely. And if we go back to our initial comparison of, batch A over here has ale yeast, and it's kind of that honey brew on the back end, and then batch B over here has champagne yeast, and it's that dry, floral, crisp, thinner experience. And you add fruit to both of those. Depending on when you add the fruit, the yeast is going to influence that fruit expression hugely. If you add the fruit during fermentation, as long as you manage the fermentation properly and punch down the cap and integrate all of the flavor compounds from that fruit into the mead, the honey brew batch A is going to express a much like sweeter, richer, softer fruit expression, whereas the honey champagne will express this like much drier, crisp, more tannic, because the sugar will totally be fermented, and the phenolics and esters will be much lower, but the alcohol will be much higher, so it'll be like a hotter experience. So if we were to ground that even further, say we add raspberries to both, the honey brew is going to have this like sweeter, juicier raspberry component, whereas the honey champagne is going to have this like dry, tannic, floral raspberry aroma and much less of the fruit expression. But if you like added them just in secondary, right after the primary fermentation, then it's going to be a totally different beast. It's going to be juicier and fruitier on both sides. It's almost like if I could make like a music analogy, it's like you're turning up the bass, the treble, and the mid-range all at the same time when you add them in secondary. Whereas if you add them in primary, the yeast is gonna really influence which range gets expressed. Like the champagne range, the champagne yeast is only gonna turn up those aromatics of the raspberry fruit, whereas the honey is gonna express the sweetness and the sugars as well. And that's where Ken Schramm talks about the actual compounds and what the yeast actually eat and what they turn them into, which is like what happens when you've been doing this for 40 years. You can think about all that at one time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think my next question is to Brandon is, do hops have that same concept in beer? Like it depends on when you add the hops and you definitely get different flavors out of them?
Yeah, for sure. The biggest difference is that when you're brewing beer, you will generally add hops to the boil, which it isomerizes the acids in the hops, which allow them to be in solution, like if you think oil and water don't mix, so the oils and the hops aren't going to go into the solution of your wort. But if you boil it, then it does. It isomerizes, so the bitterness of the hops are imparted in the beer if you boil them. But dry hopping, which is like where a lot of people, like when you think of a hoppy beer, it's say an IPA. Those aromas and to a lesser degree flavors come from dry hopping, which is generally the standard way to dry hop is after fermentation's done, you remove the yeast and then add the hops. So at that point, it's still fermentation temperature, a little bit below fermentation temperature, like maybe 10 degrees below, but it's not being boiled. And so you're not really getting much bitterness. The theory is that you're getting none, but I think in practice you do pick up some bitterness from dry hopping, but it's way less than when you're actually boiling the hops. So long story short, if you want a very bitter beer, you would add a lot of hops to the boil, and you'd get your bitterness. It's calculated in IBUs, which is some people say it's not really something you should go on because there's a lot of other ways bitterness can be expressed in beer that aren't IBUs per se, but you could also hypothetically have a beer that's really hoppy where someone smells it, they're like, whoa, it smells like hops, but the bitterness would be very low because you're not adding much hops to the boil, but then you're adding a ton of hops to the dry hop aspect. And then even when you add the hops to the boil, there's a relatively new concept called hop bursting, where you add basically as much or more hops that you would have added throughout the boil, but you do it all at the end. So they're being boiled, but not for very long. And so you're doing a large addition to get the bitterness, but the concept is because you're doing it right at the end of the boil, like last 5 minutes of the boil, you're not boiling off as much of the aromatics. And so you're getting like sort of like more of the delicate aspects of a hop that would be boiled off if you added it and boiled for 90 minutes.
Okay, so a lot of hop in beer has nothing to do with the actual yeast. It has to do with like when you're adding it in the boil and
generally the only exception to that is another relatively new concept called biotransformation, where you're adding the hops before fermentation. So basically you're adding hops to the tank, putting your wort in the tank, adding yeast. So now the yeast is fermenting while the hops are in the tank, and so the compounds in the hops are actually being
fermented.
So that's like what Frank was talking about with fruit, where the yeast are interacting with the fruit in the primary fermentation.
Yeah.
So it's more similar to that.
Yeah, but to a lesser degree, just because hops aren't contributing sugars, so the yeast aren't like eating up the hops
like they would a raspberry.
They would a raspberry. But some of the compounds in the hops are being transformed because they're
running through the fermentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Genetics.
That's
sense. Crazy.
Yeah, that is pretty cool. So when it comes to bringing it back to yeast and mead, I know we talked about there's like dry meads and sweet meads, and like it's all about your goal when you're going into making mead and what you want out of it. So from your experience in mead, if we take those two, like you said, a champagne usually produces a drier mead essentially, and a sweet mead might use an ale yeast or a lager yeast.
Well, sweet mead yeast is like a sweet wine yeast that you probably start with a higher honey ratio, and then it ferments to like 10-12%, but it leaves a lot of residual sugar, and its characteristic is like clean but not ale-y. So like why yeast sweet mead yeast is this typical sweet mead yeast that a lot of people use, and it like doesn't really accentuate anything. So if we're talking about sweet mead yeast versus ale yeast versus champagne yeast, they're kind of different things.
Okay, I think my question would be specifically, if you're looking to make a sweet mead or a dry mead, where would you start with yeast selection if that was my end goal?
Yeah, so a sweet mead or a dry mead, that's a big choice,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and if we're talking about honey expression in both, right, and like we take a root honey, like here at Golden Coast Mead, one of the things we'd love to do is find the best characteristics of a honey and ask ourselves, how can we bring this out in the mead? So, for instance, there is a yeast called Sensi, which really accentuates citrus character, floral character. So if I'm gonna use a highly floral and fruity honey, it's probably gonna be my go-to if I want to make like a dry, floral, fruity expressing mead. If I wanted to make a sweet mead that amplified the floral fruitiness, like D47 is one that a lot of people use. I find that it's kind of middle of the road and kind of like bland, but a lot of it's like a workhorse mead. 71B is one that a lot of meaderies use, and it seems to contribute a little more florality and complexity than 47. So those are like core yeast, but yeast companies are coming out with new ones all the time, and they're starting to advertise what their influence on mead is, and so you like pull out their catalog and you look at their whole spectrum of yeasts, and usually there's like a chart, like, okay, is this one suited to big fruity whites? You know, is this one, it's gonna put out a lot of tropical fruit flavors, and it's like, oh, okay, my honey is already starting with that. I'm gonna try this yeast with this honey and see if it does amplify the tropical fruit characteristics of this mead, or of this honey in this mead.
Gotcha. So if I'm new to mead and I pull out one of those sheets, I probably get lost real quick.
Yeah.
And you don't.
I mean, it's still like, I think one of the questions that we're constantly grappling with is like, what's practical in this situation, right? Like, we're starting to implement this R&D program where we can like come up with how many recipes over the course of this business? Like 300. So it's a lot of fun, but which ones are scalable? Which ones are at that intersection of what we like to make and what our customers are excited about and want to keep buying from us, and then those become regular offerings, right? Like in that intersection of that Venn diagram. Then there's others that are called wins awards, but like it kind of seems like when you find the thing that you're really stoked on and that your customer's stoked on, you just need to find the right category to win the award in, which is like a gamesmanship thing more than it is like a craftsmanship thing. But to come back to your question, you get lost in that catalog. What do you do?
So like, what if I'm looking to make a sweet mead and I'm in that catalog? What are like the things you look for in the yeast? Is it like the attenuation? Is it like flocculation? Is it ABV? Like, what is it specifically you're looking for on that sheet?
Yeah, so you kind of want to like reverse engineer from your ideal. So you kind of imagine, okay, here's this honey. Ooh, I'm picking up these flavor profiles. I think if we do our job, it's going to express these things in this way. Okay. So you almost like do the 6S method backwards. Like, it's gonna be golden and you know, bright. Maybe not. You know, there are people that are into hazy, and like, if you want the yeast characteristic to be in there, then you leave it hazy. But that means that it's gonna be relatively easy to filter, which means you want that higher flocculation. The aroma is going to be like, let's just take an orange blossom. We want it to just be like a ton of jasmine flowers and citrus blossoms right in the nose. So we're going to look for yeasts that really express floral, citrus, fruity qualities. And that's going to winnow down the list from like probably 12 or 15 in one manufacturer for sweet wines.
So you would start with how your honey tastes, what characteristics you like in your honey, and that's what you would start with yeast. Is I want to find yeast that express or enhance those flavors in my honey. Yep. To narrow down your huge list, that's what you would start with.
Or balance and oppose, right? If you're dealing with this funky honey that's like, oh, this is cool, there's some cool characteristics to this, but if I go too far, it's gonna like not be exciting. So to flesh that out specifically, let's say we take like a leatherwood honey, which has this like astringent, animal-y menthol, but then there's like this deep, rich butterscotch thing going on in it, right?
Okay.
So I'm gonna want to play up that butterscotch so that like when people are drinking it, that's this kind of base note that's pleasant, but I'm gonna want some phenolics and some esters to allow that leathery funkiness to kind of come through. Okay. And you might need an aging program to like balance it all out and soften out the sharp edges. So that's like another layer of complexity here.
So if I'm looking for yeast though with that specific honey, would you still start off with flavor? So you would still start off with yeast that enhance a butterscotch flavor, is where you would start on that list.
Yeah, and if you can find something that's both butterscotch and clove, leather, you know, some spicy phenolic characteristic that is in the honey itself, then there's a good chance that when you ferment this mead, it's gonna preserve and in a way accentuate those characteristics in the honey.
Gotcha. And then after you winnow down your list and you have a list of yeasts that have similar or matching or balancing flavors to the honey you're tasting, what's the next thing you're looking for with that yeast?
Yeah. So we talked flocculation,
Uh-huh.
which is how likely it is to settle, because if you want a clear, bright mead and you're starting with a low flocculating yeast, like, it's going to be work. You're going to have to add a lot of clarifiers, and then you're going to have to filter it. And not to say that that can be done and we don't do that, it's just going to add layers of work and cost that you need to take into perspective when you do the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol attenuation is a key piece, right? If you're imagining a low ABV, sweet, rich, mead, but you go for a 12 to 14% fermenting yeast, it's going to eat all the sugar, and you're going to have this dry, kind of hot, like, not so pleasant experience, right?
Uh-huh.
So ABV is a key piece that you need to align with your desired outcome
When you're picking yeast.
Yeah.
So like you would essentially look at flocculation and ABV secondly after you find a flavor.
I mean, that can disqualify you, right? If ABV is outside of your end state, though there are things you can do, like under pitch, and then maybe you exhaust your yeast before they have a chance to ferment all of it, which is possible. And the science on that is not developed, but the practice, there are people who do that. Like, I know one mead maker who starts with a very high sugar content and just counts on the yeast exhausting themselves when they get to his target ABV, and then the rest of the residual sugar's in there and it's stable. Yeah, so that's crazy. And like, it's because they've had a huge amount of experience to be able to do that.
Yeah. So talk me through the benefits of doing something like that.
The benefits of
So
low pitching?
Well, no. So, I mean, one of the things that is tricky with sweet is leaving sugar in the mead and getting it stable and letting it stay stable afterwards.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, this person that you're talking about doesn't have to worry about having a stable sweet because it attenuated.
They still have. They worry. I mean, they are fanatical about cleaning. They count on a low pH, a very low pH, but there's so much sugar in there that there's balance when that pH is that low, because 3.2 pH and below has a much lower risk of spoilage or unintentional fermentation and flavor shift, unacceptable flavor shift, because that 3.2 pH is like this magic number. When you're underneath it, the likelihood that a microorganism is going to reproduce in that fluid is way lower.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's 3.3, 3.4, up to 3.6, like, that's happy town for a lot of spoilage organisms. So relying on a low pH, like I've heard below 3 in some cases, which in a like dry mead would be like my teeth, like my gums are sticking, my lips are sticking to my gums and they won't even slide over my teeth because I've like wiped out all the saliva with the acid in the liquid. So pH is a big part of their program, and apparently the osmotic pressure of the residual honey prevents spoilage as well. So there's so much sugar left over when an organism gets in there, the honey sucks the liquid out of the organism, thus preventing it from reproducing. Which is pretty cool.
That's why honey is like antimicrobial.
One of the two reasons. There's also the enzyme that the bees add to the honey as a part of their storage process, and it I forget the enzyme's name. That's embarrassing, but it basically creates a hydrogen peroxide molecule, an OH, when it mixes with water, and so you get both of those impacts stabilizing honey.
Okay, so that's sweet mead essentially. You're looking to leave sugar after fermentation has completed, essentially, to make it sweet.
That's like super high. Like if you're comfortable with a very high final sugar, then that's a strategy. But if you want more of like a normal dessert wine or sweet wine, you got to use preservatives or have some other form of stabilization in place, because the risk is just so high.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So when it comes to a dry mead, like you use champagne yeast as like something that could produce a dry mead.
Yeah.
Would that be your go-to if you were just generally trying to produce a normal dry mead, or are there other yeast strains out there that are more common than a champagne yeast?
So champagne yeast basically always gives this characteristic of florality, thinness. To an extent, it can go into minerality if the florality of the honey isn't pronounced. And then that can be just disjointed if it's not like a few notes that are close together. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So like the first sip in a good, I think, champagne style mead, there's florality, there's a hint of honey aromatics, and then there's this champagne body that kind of like pulls through to this conclusion that is really delicate and balanced and long, right? But that's like a hard end state to hit.
Mm-hmm.
If you have some kind of flaw in the fermentation, that mid palate's going to be like stinky, and then the finish is probably not going to be that like replay of the floral honey sweetness with the champagne complexity, just like echoing on, right? It's going to be like funkiness.
Yeah.
So champagne yeast is tricky, but if you can pull it off, it can make some really beautiful meads. There are dry yeasts that I think are a little more forgiving and a little more body producing. Like they actually produce sterols, which are a fatty acid or a lipid that creates sensations of body in the mouth. And they'll play out certain characteristics depending on your selection. Like different yeasts will either go for that fruity, tropical fruit, citrus, like that side of this dry equation, or it can go like minerality, flint, like what are some of the other minerality qualities that a yeast can express? Got any, Brandon? A dry fermenting yeast, like a soft blanc yeast, right? Grassiness is another one. Like there's kind of a spectrum of flavor characteristics that different dry white wine yeasts will impart, and then depending on what honey you're using and where you want to amplify or balance flavor compounds within that honey, you're going to kind of go those directions. So there's a lot more than just champagne yeast to make a dry mead.
Okay, so essentially using white wine yeast is another option, and champagne yeast, but it just depends on, once again, how does the honey taste and what's the end state that you're looking to accomplish.
Nailed it, man.
Is there anything like we didn't really cover about yeast that you want to talk about?
Yes.
Okay.
Flawed fermentations
Flawed.
and problems with yeast, right?
Okay.
There are some yeasts that are known for producing sulfur.
Okay.
And so in mead, that's particularly problematic because honey is naturally antiseptic, naturally stresses yeast out. So the more stress the yeast get, the more likely they are to produce sulfur. So if you are going to use that kind of yeast, like some yeasts just seem to produce sulfur no matter what, no matter how you treat them. But theoretically, you might be able to optimize conditions. So like some of the biggest phenolic and ester producing yeasts also produce the most sulfur, right? The Belgian yeasts and English yeasts. So, but like say there's some characteristic of one of those yeasts that you want to use and you've got this risk of sulfur, you got to be super mindful of your nutrient addition, aeration, temp control to make that yeast as happy as possible and minimize to eliminate that sulfur production, because sulfur production in mead just creates a lot of problems. Like in beer, it's sometimes desirable in certain styles.
Yeah.
And when you, by the time you're done hopping your beer and there's all these non-fermented complex sugars like maltose and dextrose, right? That sulfur is just like kind of an interesting burny kind of note to balance the other characteristics of the beer. Whereas if that's in mead, you don't have the hops to cover it up, you don't have the maltose dextrose to balance it out. It's just like rotten eggs, and that's not pleasant. Like no one likes drinking rotten eggs.
So is that description on the yeast description? Like, hey, this yeast generally produces a sulfur, or is that something that you just have to experience after you buy the yeast and try it?
It depends on the producer where they list that. Like some you have to dive super deep to find the sulfur producing characteristics, and some will list it on the basic overview chart.
Oh, okay. So what are some examples of that and some yeasts that are common that produce sulfur in your experience?
So, omega yeast will like list sulfur production on the overview document, whereas like fermentus will like you have to get into the technical data sheet of that specific yeast to find out sulfur production. Like basically you're dealing with Red Star, Lallemand, Y yeast, White Labs, Omega yeast, Lavlin. Those are like the 6 major yeast companies that come to mind, and they all talk about sulfur in different places.
Okay.
So some of them will present it on their overview sheets, and then some of them will only share it in the like deep dive technical spec. But I recommend that anyone who's producing commercially or considering producing commercially pulls out the tech spec on the yeast to confirm all their assumptions once they've like winnowed through the list.
So you think it's super important to consider sulfur in your decision making, and if you're going with a yeast, you want to be able to know and plan ahead for the sulfur production if it exists in the yeast you're choosing.
I mean, that's like a dangerous road, and volume's a big question, right? Like if you're doing 1,000 liter or bigger batch, that's tens of thousands of dollars of meat right there. So yeah, you want to mitigate that risk. But if you're just doing a 20 liter batch, 5 gallon batch to do a test, and like, okay, there's a risk of sulfur production. Let's see what happens if we control for it. Like, can we make a clean mead? That's a much more acceptable risk, I think.
And if you had the option between yeast that just didn't have any sulfur production, at least stated, versus one that said it might have the chance, you would definitely always go with the one that doesn't have it stated, or is it not that?
If everything else is
clear?
equal, yeah. If everything else is equal, like don't make that risk part of your problems that you have to worry about.
Is there any? So when you say everything else is equal, what's usually the trade-off to like using something that potentially has sulfur?
Complexity.
Complexity.
Yeah, like the risk of sulfur often comes with an increased chance for a more complex drink. Like there's going to be more phenolics, more esters that as this meat ages are going to link together to make a flavor molecule chain that's unique and unprecedented and potentially amazing. But if some sulfur got introduced in there, that could all get lost or ruined.
Gotcha. So it's generally like when you go with the safer yeast, it's generally more
Middle of the road
end product, and if you want a super complex product, that's usually where you risk a sulfur note
or any kind of off. I mean, yeah, like more finicky yeasts can create more complex meads, but require greater technical skill to pull it off.
Gotcha. And a big part of that technical skill is knowing how to manage sulfur if it starts to happen.
Yeah, but which is really just making sure your yeasts are happy.
Gotcha. Okay, so sulfur is one of those objective flaws that we can taste or smell when we're making mead, and we definitely want to look out for. Are there any other objective flaws that yeast packages state generally that you would look out for? And are there any subjective flaws that you kind of can taste or look for on labels for yeast?
Me? Well, yeah, with beer, certain yeasts will produce certain compounds that are undesirable at a high level, but might be desirable at a very low level, or that you might want to eliminate entirely. And so like diacetyl being one of them. You can have a yeast that produces diacetyl.
And what's diacetyl again?
It's like the buttery, like fake butter flavor. It's literally fake butter at a movie theater. It has diacetyl in it. So, and it also has a mouth feel too. So if you drink a beer that's a diacetyl bomb, as they say, it's gonna feel like you have that fake butter in your mouth. It's like really oily and slick. And so you can have a yeast that produces diacetyl, in a high amount or that you wouldn't want in your finished product. But over time, the yeast then metabolizes that diacetyl and breaks it down into its precursor, which is
under the right conditions. You got to change the
Yes.
conditions that the diacetyl was made in for the yeast to
temperature.
break it down.
Yeah, temperature being the main one. Yeah. And that's called a diacetyl rest, usually in brewing. And so one thing with diacetyl in particular, but this probably applies to other chemicals that are considered flaws in beer and mead, but you can have a beer where it's fermenting and it's getting towards its final gravity and its terminal gravity, and you're tasting it, you're smelling it, and it's got diacetyl present. But then over time, that diacetyl is going to drop until the point where you can't really smell or taste it. But if you were to hypothetically package that beer, then it's possible that the precursors could then reform and create diacetyl after the fact. So as the beer is on the shelf, you can have someone buy it and go, hey, there's diacetyl in this, and the brewer's like, no, there's not. I tasted it before we packaged it. There's no diacetyl. But that's something that can occur later. So one thing brewers do is a forced diacetyl test, where you take a sample of the beer, you heat it up to try and force the precursors to reform diacetyl, and then you smell and taste it. And if you do that test and then there's no diacetyl after the fact, then you can be pretty confident that you're not going to have diacetyl down the line.
Dang.
So,
And we've had diacetyl in mead before, and it's a bummer. But you can theoretically get rid of it if the yeast is still active and
Yeah.
you drop the temp, and then it goes away. It's wild. And I think this. So for listeners who didn't hear episode 3, where we talk about flaws and healthy mead production, and the number one job of a mead maker is making yeast happy by giving them the temp, aeration, and nutrient profile that they need. And if you don't do that, you're just inviting all kinds of problems that create bad tasting mead. And if you do that, the likelihood that your mead's going to be delicious is much higher. Go to episode 3 if you haven't listened to that one. It's critical. And then let us know what questions you have, because we really want to help lift up the mead making industry by sharing our hard-won wisdom around here. And then Brando, I think you had another point or question that you wanted to make. So.
Well, yeah, just subjectively, I know we're talking about diacetyl and sulfur, but I know those two are objectives, but subjectively, are there any experiences, Frank, you've had with any honey and I guess, is there anything you look out for subjectively when you're considering yeast and honey combinations?
Yeah, I mean, I think just defining those terms, subjective versus objective. So objective is something you can objectively measure, right? You can take some metric, you can compare a sample against that metric, and then come up with a number, and there's some threshold where it's just unacceptable.
Yeah.
And this actually derives from research that was done in the brewing industry in the 50s, where they found the flaws that could happen in brewing, and then had a bunch of tasters who were trained, and then they measured where a objective flaw was unacceptable.
Yeah.
So that remains to be done in the mead world, and I think it'll be really cool when it is done. But until then, you've got objective flaws like sulfur and diacetyl and mercaptans and butyric, where it's if it's over a certain threshold, it's just gross and no one wants to drink it. Though there are some people who are blind to certain flaws and might find it acceptable. So what is that number? That's for each meter to determine right now, and hopefully Mead Institute will do a lot of work of sharing that number, those numbers, and developing what those standards are. But then on the subjective side, it's just this kind of question well, to whom is it pleasant and to whom is it not? And for me, there's a lot of meads that have been made where it's it's a mead and it's not objectively bad. It's not rotten egg smelling or butter popcorn or burnt tire in the case of mercaptans, or stomach acid in the case of butyric. But when I drink it, it just comes off kind of meh. It's subjectively it didn't come together in any kind of interesting or compelling way that delivers value to me. So I'm probably not gonna buy this, or might not even. I guess I'll finish the glass. Something that's subjectively not that great. Might finish the glass if depending on the situation. But I'm not gonna buy that again. I'm not gonna go buy a bottle. I'm not gonna tell my friends about it. So when I'm thinking about yeast, it's like if we're doing the safe thing, the likelihood that we're gonna come up with one of those meads is much higher. Whereas if we're choosing a more high performance yeast that has some risk, there's like more of an opportunity for reward there too.
Gotcha. So essentially, like generally speaking, the safer yeast are just producing a really basic mead, and most of the time, and subjectively,
Yeah.
and the risk less reward to using yeast that have potential objective flaws, but if you can navigate those flaws, the reward at the end could be much greater when it comes to flavor and complexity in your mead.
Yeah. Totally.
Okay.
The way I kind of think about it is with your sugar source and your yeast, you have just a huge amount of chemicals that are being metabolized and turned into other things. And like we were talking about diacetyl, like there's chemicals that you don't want, but they can be broken down, and then you have precursors of those, and you have all these moving parts that are going to sort of recombine and make new flavors. And then with aging, certain things are going to, like, certain chemicals are going to combine and certain chemicals are going to be broken down. And so the more pieces you have, the more potential you have for something really awesome. But you also have the potential for disaster too. And so if you're using a simpler sugar source and a more predictable, simple mead, you have fewer of those pieces like being juggled, and you have a more predictable outcome, but it's going to be like less complex and less,
Potentially spectacular.
yeah.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
I think like potentially all those things are knowable. Like all of these chemicals are not just like some theoretical thing. It's like with study, like, and beer has gone through more of this study than mead has, but like these chemicals are all knowable, and how they form into other compounds is knowable. And so it's just a matter of like people have to figure that out, and then those spectacular meads that are complex and hard to nail down become like something that you can predictably, reliably do once all those pieces are known.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys for sitting down and talking about mead and how everything ferments.
Yeah, it's the yeast that make the mead. We are just the yeast tenders. Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.